Okay, good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second meeting in 2013 of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. As usual, can I ask everyone to ensure they've switched off mobile phones and other electronic devices, please. Agenda item 1. Our first item of business today is to agree to take agenda item 8 in private. Are we all agreed? Thank you. Agenda items 2 and 3 are subordinate legislation. Item 2 is oral evidence from the Minister for Welfare and Housing and Scottish Government officials on an affirmative instrument, the Draft Council Tax Variation for Unoccupied Dwellings Scotland Order 2013. In the interest of efficiency, I propose that the committee take evidence at the same time from the Minister on agenda items 3 and 4, which are two negative statutory instruments, the Council Tax Administration and Enforcement Scotland Amendment Regulations 2012, SSI 2012/338, and the Council Tax Exempt Dwelling Scotland Amendment Order 2012, SSI 2012/339. Motions to annul both of these instruments have been lodged by Margaret Mitchell. Members have papers setting out the purpose of all three instruments, as well as a copy of the instruments themselves. I'd like to welcome Margaret Burgess, Minister for Housing and Welfare, Stephen Jones, Policy Manager for Housing and Supply Division, Colin Brown, Senior Principal Legal Officer with the Scottish Government. Welcome all. Minister, can I ask you to speak to the instruments and your motion and to approve the affirmative SSI, and also to speak to the instruments and motions to annul the negative SSI. Oh, no, I beg your pardon. Minister, just leave it at that, the first bit that I said. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Well, this instrument will allow local authorities to impose a council tax increase of up to 100% for homes that have been empty for 1 year or longer. It will also allow councils to offer a discount of between 10 and 50% for homes that are unoccupied for between 6 months and a year. And this increase won't apply to second homes. The regulations define a second home as a home which is not someone's main residence but is furnished and unoccupied for a minimum of 25 days a year. The regulations were drafted following a consultation and dialogue with key stakeholders, including a working group whose members were made up of local authorities and COSLA. We've listened to stakeholders, Parliament and others, and have amended our proposals as the policy has been developed. Our consultation process revealed that most stakeholders were in favour of the draft regulations, but required guidance that a local authority can follow. So to help local authorities, we've developed draft guidance which we'll further refine with stakeholders before publishing. I'm keen to make sure the regulations can be enforced to help tackle owners deliberately leaving their homes empty and encourage them to bring these homes back into use. At the same time, I want to leave enough flexibility to avoid penalising those who are genuinely trying to bring their home into use, for example by renting or selling it. That's why those owners will not have to pay the council tax increase for 2 years after the property becomes empty. I recognise also that some of the administrative challenges implementing a council tax increase is likely to bring. However, I don't believe the regulations will place an onerous burden on local authorities. The new powers are to be used at the discretion of councils, and it is for each council to decide if the benefits of applying the increase outweigh the cost of administering it. There's little sense in giving...
We're going to do them later.
So is that's the affirmative? Are you wanting me to stop at the affirmative or carry on with the negatives, Convener?
Carry on, please, Minister.
Okay, thank you. Okay. It would make little sense to give councils the power to apply a council tax increase and not give them the tools they need to implement it. So these instruments will help councils to apply the council tax increase effectively. They will oblige owners to provide councils with the evidence that they need to identify whether a property is liable for an increase. They impose a maximum penalty of £500 for non-compliance and also include provisions to prevent an owner avoiding the increase by claiming repeated exemptions. The Council Tax Administration and Enforcement Scotland Amendment Regulations 2012 place an obligation on owners, residents or managing agents to provide to a local authority on request any information they have which the local authority requires to establish whether a discount or an increase in council tax liability should apply. Taxpayers must also notify councils of a change of occupancy status of a property, and a penalty of up to £500 can be charged for non-compliance. The Council Tax Exempt Dwelling Scotland Amendment Order 2012 will make it more difficult for council owners to avoid paying a council tax increase or reduced discount by repeatedly claiming an empty dwelling exemption. Homes would be required to be reoccupied for at least 3 months before an owner can receive a further empty dwelling exemption from council tax, and at the moment that's 6 weeks they can claim another exemption if the property becomes empty. We've consulted widely on these regulations and amended them in light of comments from committee and stakeholders, and we'll continue to work with local authorities to develop guidance and help them to effectively implement the regulations. And I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you very much, Minister. Could I invite Margaret Mitchell to speak to the instruments and her motions to annul the negative SSI?
Thank you, Convener. First of all, the Minister comes to committee to move the motion approving the council tax variation for unoccupied Scotland dwelling regulations 1213, which enacts the Scottish Government's policy on unoccupied domestic property rates relief, which Local Government Unoccupied Properties, etc. 2012 Act paved the way for. I speak against the motion, Minister, and the 2013 regulations, and move the motions in my name to annul the 2012 regulation and the 2012 order. Now, do you want to give my reasons just now for doing so?
Yes, please.
The Unoccupied Property Act is a piece of legislation that I believe should never have seen the light of day, as it's based on false premises and questionable propositions, in assuming that the majority of property owners, both domestic and non-domestic alike, keep properties empty out of choice rather than through a fundamental lack of demand due to the current economic climate. The government did not provide any robust evidence to suggest that punishing property owners with ever higher council tax bills would bring properties back into use. Furthermore, the policy enacted by the regulations seems to me to be all stick and no carrot. Property owners should not be punished for being unable to let their properties. And in introducing this policy, which the Minister brings to the committee, I believe the SNP is contradicting a key election pledge, namely to freeze the council tax through the next Parliament, because in essence what the regulations do is allow local authorities to double the normal council tax rates for certain types of property, which in turn means that the SNP is effectively tearing up a cornerstone promise from its very own manifesto by proposing these regulations. Any additional money is not ring-fenced. There seems to be a variation between the policy for being able to prove actively advertising and actively letting. I'd be interested to hear the Minister's explanation for that. And I think really the full intent behind this is revealed when we look at the BRIA and the rationale for the government intervention, which is outlined on page 2, when it says, as the Scottish Government is proposing to give councils the power to charge an increase but leave it to the council's discretion whether or not to use the power at all, and if so, to what extent. This will allow councils to take account of how much of a problem empty homes are in their area, and also, and I think this is the key part, and also the level of requirement for additional revenue support for local priorities, to support local priorities. And these are priorities, Minister, which are not ring-fenced for housing. So for all of these reasons, I will oppose the motion for approval of the 2013 draft regulations and move the motions in my name to annul SSI 338 and 339.
Thank you. Can I ask members if they have any questions? Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. Just wish to make a few points. I think this is a very important piece of legislation that incentivises owners of unoccupied property to make these properties available to either the rental or purchase market. Certainly in the northeast of Scotland, we suffer, if anything, from a shortage of available property, and any tool that becomes available to our councils to help them incentivise the owners of property is likely to be a very valuable one indeed. Across Scotland, while the market in the buying and selling of properties is certainly not what it used to be, there is a concomitant increase in the rental market because, of course, it remains necessary for people to have residence. I just cite one example in an area of my previous constituency. They changed the boundaries, so it's now outside the area I represent, where a property, long-term empty, significantly causing difficulties in one of the villages, after, I think, 6 or 7 years research on the part of a number of people, it was discovered to be owned by someone, a company based in Panama. On behalf of my constituents, I corresponded at substantial cost in Spanish, because I had to pay translation fees, with the owner in an attempt to bring this property back into use. I have to say we failed. This set of measures that we have before us as a committee is one way of assisting in these kind of circumstances, assisting communities who wish to see properties occupied rather than deserted, who wish to see that there is property available for people who require it. And in areas such as the northeast of Scotland, where we have seen a substantial number of people moving to the northeast to fill many of the vacancies that there are in important industries, I'm sure that this is a measure that will be of significant advantage. And of course, the bottom line is, it will be for the councils to decide whether this gives them the powers that will help them solve the particular local issues that there are. I've illustrated the North East issues. I'm sure that others in other areas will have different needs, but then councils can make different decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. We seem to have moved into debate rather than just questions. However, I'm not going to stop members from doing that. Anne McTaggart was next on my list, please.
Thanks, Convener. Whilst we don't disagree with the overall principle of the bill, as something does need to happen to bring properties back into use, at stage 2 and 3, Minister, I had actually brought an amendment. It was up to 50%. Can I verify, is what you're saying, you are aiming to put it to 100%?
Yes, yes, in answer to that question, yes, we're saying that councils can apply a charge of up to 100%, and that was what got the support from stakeholders as well, that they can apply it up to 100%. That doesn't mean they have to apply 100%, but they can apply a charge of up to 100%.
And that would be at the discretion of each and every individual local authority?
Local authorities make that decision.
And who would be monitoring that?
Well, that's up to local authorities make that decision based on how they look at their empty properties, what they want to do when they're creating their own policy on it. And that would be up to local authorities to apply the charge that they feel is appropriate for their area. And it's up to their members to monitor their policies.
Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. So I do welcome these statutory instruments, and I very much understand that no policy will actually deal with every possible kind of eventuality out in society. But I've got a couple of questions. The first one is obviously that with the council tax variation for unoccupied dwellings regulations, they are going to replace the 2005 regulations. If these were to pass through the Parliament, if an individual actually has a ruling under the 2005 regulations, will they be allowed to continue until their end before any potential, until the new regulations actually apply or potentially apply to them, or if someone does actually have a ruling under the 2005 regulations, would that ruling then stop once these regulations pass?
Pass that one to the legal team, I think.
These will replace the 2005 regulations in their entirety. So the 2005 regulations will apply up to the date these regulations come in, and then the new regulations will take over from that point. If somebody's, for example, taken an appeal to valuation committee and won an argument against council under the old regulations, then that would presumably inform what they're entitled to under the new regulations, but they would be dealt with in terms of the new scheme from the date these come in.
Right, okay. Okay. The second point is just regarding the word occupied. It might sound really pedantic, but can I ask for a definition or a clarification of the word occupied? And the reason for that is that I do have a constituent who, this household, they know at the present moment they don't live in their house. They are living in a rented accommodation because the house, there was a number of things happened. So they have spent a considerable amount of money trying to renovate their property. And I mean, this has been on for longer than 6 months. It's been on actually for a number of years. And it has been a considerable amount of money, but there have been delays in actually kind of finalising the work due to various levels of ill health that have actually taken place over this period of time as well. But in terms of the reason for the occupied question, one of the family actually from time to time spends a night in the house. The house is not furnished, so apart from a couch, but they will go there late at night, sleep in the house overnight, and then in the morning when they wake up, they will go to their rented accommodation and get ready and eat and do whatever. So I just like a clarification on the word occupied. What does occupied actually mean?
I think, well, we're told here, but an occupied dwelling is a dwelling that's someone's sole or main residence that they're living in. So that's an occupied dwelling. An unoccupied dwelling is clearly when they're not living in it as a sole or main residence, and we have a definition of a second home, which is a home that's lived in for 25 days a year and is furnished. So in the circumstances that you outline, if the property is unfurnished and has been unfurnished and unoccupied as a main residence for 12 months or more, that would be an unoccupied dwelling. Am I correct? I think I'm correct in my definition of that. Obviously, local authorities will determine what areas and how they apply a charge or an increase in charge in that, but that would be an unoccupied property.
Okay, thank you.
John Pentland, please.
Thank you, Convener. Previously, obviously, we have agreed in principle about the unoccupied properties, and one of the amendments that we did put forward during the bill stage was with regards to the variation, to what level the local authority could charge. And as my colleague Anne McTaggart says, that we had sort of put forward that amendment to be 50%. In response to my colleague's question, you say that local authority would monitor, that variation. Surely it would be in the interest of the government to have an assessment as to how that regulation would indeed work. And would you be requesting an assessment be submitted to the government?
The government will be monitoring how it goes on. In terms of any policies of the Scottish Government that we put in, and we monitor council tax, so we would monitor what's happening, but it's up to the local authority to determine what is appropriate in their area. The whole purpose of this the legislation is to have flexibility for local authorities to apply it and how they see they can use it to the best advantage in their area, and that's what we would be doing. And certainly we'd be aware of what's happening in every area and we'll be looking at it.
Yeah, but if that monitoring shows that the regulation is not working,
will the government review that situation?
I'm not quite sure how you mean it's not working, because it is for local authorities they don't require to use it at all. These regulations, it is discretionary for local authorities whether they use it or not. So it is up to them to determine if it's something they want to use, how they want to administer it, and to what benefit it is to their local authority area. So, yes, and we would look at the overall picture of how that's happening throughout Scotland, but local authorities are very much, there's flexibility for them in this legislation.
With regards to the discretion for local authorities, is it an all or nothing power? And, for example, if a house should remain empty and the local authority use that discretion, if a house should remain empty for a year or more, and the local authority use the discretion of applying a 50% for the first year, does that then continue, or can the local authority revisit and maybe charge 100%?
So local authorities will look at the legislation and determine the policy that's appropriate for their area, and they will not be, the legislation doesn't allow them to pick out houses, individual houses, and say we'll apply it there, we won't apply it there. What it does allow them to do is look at areas of low demand, look at housing, classes of housing, and determine how best to use the legislation in their area. So there is flexibility and discretion within the legislation for local authorities to use, and that's how we would see them, using it. They determine how much they want to apply in terms of it, but it's not a case of, yes, we'll apply 50% this week and change it the following week, and I think local authorities are aware of that.
So the assurance that you're giving the committee, Minister, is that the local authority, when they set whatever that variation should be within the 100%, that it won't change from week to week or from year to year?
It shouldn't change from week to week. I think there is discretion to change it as they review their own policies and procedures. I think any piece of, any local authority who doesn't review how they're applying a piece of legislation, whatever it is, and look at it and look if it should be amended or not, but it won't be amended constantly, monthly, weekly. It should apply for the at least 12 months.
So after 12 months, a local authority can then go back and review?
They may wish to do that. I think I'm correct in saying that's perfectly appropriate. They may wish to do it. Some may leave it longer.
Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Just for clarification, Minister, a number of issues that have been raised by colleagues previously. Stuart McMillan raised the issue about 25 days a year in terms of a second home, the occupancy. And the policy note, I think it's the policy note, page 2, paragraph 2, refers to so the definition of a second home will require owners to provide evidence that they have been living in the home. Now, the issue is, for me, is it then goes on to say it will be for a local authority to decide what evidence is acceptable and in what circumstances it will ask for evidence. Now, I know that what you've said earlier, Minister, is will be up to the 32 local authorities how to interpret these regulations. But the difficulty is that you then go on in that paragraph and then say that any appeal may be then made to a valuation appeal committee. Now, valuation appeal committee, if you're referring to valuation board process in relation to an appeal, then many of the evaluation boards that exist in Scotland cut across local authority boundaries. Therefore, you could have a local authority, take for example, North Lanarkshire, making a decision regarding their definition of evidence for the second home, whereas in South Lanarkshire may make a different determination. However, both those local authorities come under the same valuation board. So you could actually have a valuation board making a determination on an appeal based on two different interpretations of the regulations. How would that be resolved, Minister? And would it not be better if the government actually set out clearly in the regulations what they expected in relation to evidence to prove that a second home was actually a second home?
Minister.
I think that, as we said, providing guidance which local authorities will be able to use in looking at that, and the guidance will be for every local authority. But in a situation as you're describing, I mean, what the appeal is whether this home is unoccupied or not. And I take your point, the 25 days, occupied for 25 days and has to be furnished would determine that that's a second home. And any dispute would be, as you say, if it's not. So I don't quite see the situation maybe arising as you put it, because the evaluation board will not be looking at the evidence as such in terms of what local authorities have gathered. They're looking overall terms, what evidence to suggest is this or not. Well, maybe you're right, a second home. But they will have to look at all of the evidence, and it's the evaluation board that will determine that. So at the end of the day, whether the evidence that comes from one local authority area or another local authority area is not quite, may not be the same. The evaluation board arriving at their decision will base on what they consider to be, should this property be exempt or not, because that's what the evaluation board will be looking at. Should this property be exempted or should it not?
If I'm picking you up correctly, and you may want to clarify this, that there may actually be another determination in terms of whether a second home qualifies as a second home, and that determination would be by this valuation appeal board, which may override a decision by a local authority in relation to its determination of whether or not a second home qualifies as a second home. Because if you're saying that the evidence gathered, irrespective of the evidence gathered or the evidence being asked for by a local authority in relation to the evidence to say that a second home is being used as a second home, that any appeal to evaluation appeal panel may actually overturn the council's determination of what a second home is.
Minister.
Yeah, well, we did consult with the evaluation board, and they were happy with what we put forward. But I'll maybe pass on. Do you get some other comments there? If you wish to make.
Essentially, it is about the assessment of the evidence that is presented, and whether that justifies it or does not. A council may reach a view. If a liable person, the taxpayer, is unhappy with that view, they have a right to appeal that and seek a determination from an appeal body.
Sorry for labouring this, but the issue for me is that based on the assessment, and this is where we get into the difficulty of 32 local authorities, and especially where local authorities border each other, where one local authority makes a determination in terms of what evidence they require, and yet the neighbouring authority, which comes under the same valuation board jurisdiction, then makes a different determination about what evidence is then required. What I'm trying to get to is, what then does the valuation board, appeal panel, make as their determination? Or do they come up with an alternative determination and assessment to that of the two local authorities that neighbour each other, and that's the appeal panel, the valuation appeal panel, that then makes the final decision, but is not bound by, as I understand it, by these regulations that are set out for local authorities?
I think what we're saying is that the evaluation panel will look at the evidence that's provided from the homeowner and look at the evidence that's provided from the local authority and what they've asked, what evidence they've required, and they will make their assessment based on that evidence. I think that's what we're saying. They will look at what's there. The evaluation board were quite happy and you know, with what we're proposing, and have looked at, you know, have looked at the policy notes, and they're quite happy and don't see there being a problem there. But it's certainly something that, you know, we certainly will look at. You've raised this as an issue. I don't see it as being a huge issue either. I see the evaluation board doing their role and looking at what was asked, what was provided, does that meet the requirement? Is that property unoccupied or not?
Right, thank you, Minister. Move on to the SSI cover note, page 2 once again. Just for clarification, paragraph 10, can I seek clarification about what properties will be or will receive an exemption under the council tax, full council tax? Because you've given a list of examples and I'd quite readily accept in long-term residential care, in hospital long-term, in prison, and where a dwelling has been repossessed, Minister. Could you clarify what the exemption would be for a property that's been repossessed by a lender? And surely the purpose or part of the objective of this legislation, change to legislation, is to try and bring as many empty properties into useful use as possible. Then, just as I said, seek clarification when a lender repossesses, how long the exemption would be for a home in that situation.
When a lender repossesses, until the property is sold or auctioned, it's still the original owner of the property that's liable for the council tax and that goes with that property. It doesn't transfer at the minute that the property is repossessed. That property, until it's sold, I think I'm absolutely correct in saying this, until it's sold, it belongs, just going back to my previous experience, that property, the liability remains with the original owner of the property and would be, if there were any equity in that property, any liabilities would be paid off it. So I don't think, generally when properties are repossessed, it's properties at the moment that there's negative equity on, and therefore that would not, if you're suggesting the lender should perhaps pay the council tax, I don't know if we can do that, but it's certainly something that we might look at. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I don't actually have the exempt dwellings regulation. There are separate regulations that deal with exempt dwellings and totally exempt from council tax. Now, in a repossession situation, as the Minister said, there will be two types of situation going on. One where a lender is working with someone to try to sell a property, and another where a lender, perhaps because the person has disappeared or because it's simply not resolving, does actually physically take over the property for sale. And there is certainly some provision in the existing exempt dwellings which will totally take those out of the council tax system for a period. But I'm afraid I simply don't have the detail of those with me because these don't affect them. The existing exemptions that underlie the council tax system are not affected by the new system that's being put in. The 2005 regs at the moment sit over the top of that.
Minister, thank you for your insight into where I was leading in terms of my question, because there is clearly a situation where many people who have had their homes repossessed continue to be liable for council tax as it accrues. And it would have been useful if we could have tidied up that situation in this legislation to try and release the burden of further debt to those people who have already had their homes repossessed. So while we can't change the legislation that's in front of us today, Minister, I would like to think the Minister would take that point on board and look at trying to remedy that situation as quickly as possible to ease the burden of ongoing debt when someone is not getting the use out of that property.
I've got a number of folk waiting. Supplementary on this point, gentlemen. Stuart McMillan first, please, then.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, it was on John Wilson's first question, and I'm just kind of seeking a wee bit of clarification, both actually from my colleague John and also the Minister. My kind of understanding of what was being discussed was just regarding the criteria that's actually to be laid down for the local authority and also for the valuation board. That was my kind of take of what was actually discussed, but I wasn't too sure if that actually is the case. So is the criteria for the local authority and also for the valuation board to be the same when deciding on the 25 days?
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Stevenson.
I just wanted to pick up on the Minister's use of the word sold. Because, of course, sold implies there is a transfer of value between seller and purchaser. And I just wondered whether, in fact, what the Minister was seeking to tell us was that we return to zero when there is a transfer in the registration of who owns a particular property, a heritable asset, it transfers from the ownership of one person to another without consideration of whether it's by selling, the application of a charge over the property, or whatever. And I just wanted to be clear what actually triggers changes in the circumstances around the property, and whether the clock starts again on transfer of ownership, for example, because the word used was sold, and I just didn't think that was correct.
Yes, I used perhaps sold when it should have been transferred. When the property transferred, the original owner has liability, as John Wilson has said, until the property is transferred to a new owner, not necessarily transferred to the lender that's repossessed.
Yes. Whereas, of course, liabilities that the previous owner, not now the owner, might have under the terms of their standard security for continuing liability to council tax are entirely another issue, and one that quite properly, I think, has been explored thoroughly by John Wilson.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Minister, could you provide some clarification on the impact of having the ability to prove proof of actively marketing to sell and proof of actively marketing to rent in terms of how that will affect rates relief?
In terms of the council tax increase, well, I think that local authorities, that will be part of the guidance as well, but if someone is actively marketing their home, if it's advertised through normal procedures that you would do to market your home or sell your home, then that, I think that would be taken as evidence, but the guidance will cover that, and local authorities will look at what evidence they require to ensure that a house has been put on the market or rent. In some instances, the owner may be working with a local authority's empty homes officer, and I think that would be absolute evidence that that house is going out, is actively been marketed for rent or brought into a state that it can be put out to rent. So, look, again, it's part of the discretion that local authorities can use, and will be, I think I'm correct in saying, it will be part of the guidance that we're developing with local authorities and with COSLA.
Just to be quite clear then, Minister, it isn't the case that if you're actively marketing to sell, you automatically trigger the relief, but if you're actively marketing to rent, it's discretionary. That isn't the case.
No, if you're actively marketing to sell or to rent, then it should trigger the relief. I'm correct in saying that. I'm beginning to doubt myself here. Yeah,
that's helpful. Minister, one of the regulations moves the provision for having a rental for, say, or occupation for 6 weeks and changes it now to 3 months before you would then be eligible for exemptions. Doesn't this provide a disincentive for people to accept short-term lengths to these properties, and in which case it moves against the policy intent that you've indicated you want to achieve?
No, we don't think that. We don't think that at all. In terms of 3 months rents, most short assured tenancies would run longer than 3 months, I think 6 months. So we would not think that's a disincentive to rent a property if somebody was only doing it for 3 months. No, we don't. I don't agree with that.
But aren't they more likely, if they've got the chance of a rental for 6 weeks, to say, well, no, we'll hang off, because I could find myself in a worse position. I really have to have a rental for 3 months, in which case it goes against the policy intent.
No, I don't agree. I don't agree with that. If they don't have it at the moment, if a house has been unoccupied and is then occupied again for a period of 6 weeks, they can get the exemption again. What we are saying is, if it's occupied for 3 months, am I correct, that the exemption then applies? So I don't...
Apply after 6 weeks if they rented it out, so they would, in effect, be looking for a longer rent and perhaps reject the 6 weeks.
Rented out for 6 weeks, whoever they rented it out to would be liable for the council tax on that property as their sole and main residence.
But thereafter, the exemption would not apply.
It would not apply for 3 months.
Well, that seems to me a disincentive, but I think we agree to differ on that.
Yeah,
one.
I think we'll disagree on that one.
Wilson.
Can
Convener, just to add, further follow on the point Margaret Mitchell made about actively marketing to sell or to rent, and you've indicated that guidance will be issued to local authorities to, in some form, they would advise local authorities how to measure that. My concern would be if actively marketing to sell or rent meant that the seller was fixing a price way above the average market price for properties in that area, or putting a rental, setting a rental fee for that property way above the average rental fee for that property or that area. What would be the instruction and the guidance to local authorities to determine whether or not someone was genuinely actively seeking to rent or sell a property and not trying to avoid doing that by setting a value on the property, either a property value or a rental value way above what would be expected in the market?
Colin, do you want to maybe just respond to that?
It is actually covered in the regulations, where it says that one of the factors to be considered in whether it's an appropriate marketing is the price or the proposed rent. So an authority has to look at that as well, again knowing the local circumstances, and assess what would be reasonable in the local market.
Thank you, Minister, for that clarification.
Any other questions?
Just following on from John Wilson and Margaret Mitchell there, would there then be a difference between somebody trying to sell their property through an estate agent or somebody who's trying to sell their house on their own to avoid the pay they have to give an estate agent? We would be, I would think that a estate agent would perhaps sell a house quicker than somebody who would try to sell it on their own.
I disagree with you, Mr. Pentland.
I think if the test is if somebody genuinely, we're not suggesting that it would have to be via an estate agent or via some other, agency. What we're saying is if they're genuinely got the house in the market and look at that, and some people could genuinely show that they have the house in the market, they're advertising it themselves, but most people eventually may revert to an estate agent to get their house sold. But there's no hard and fast rule in that. It's about, do we genuinely believe that this individual, this owner, is trying to sell this house, sell their property?
Okay, if I can maybe ask the final question, Minister, and that's round about COSLA and local authorities' attitude towards what you're proposing. Are they happy with the flexibilities that have been put forward by the government in this legislation?
Yes, the local authorities in COSLA have welcomed the flexibility, and I've certainly spoken to a number of local authorities who have indicated that to me, that they're happy, and particularly with the flexibility that they have in using this legislation.
Thank you very much, Minister. If we could move on to agenda item 4, which is subordinate legislation. The item 4 is the debate on the motion to approve the draft council tax variation for unoccupied dwellings Scotland Order 2013, on which we have just taken oral evidence. Is there any member who wishes to speak in this debate? No. If no member wishes to debate the instrument, can I ask the Minister then to move motion S4M 5273?
I move.
Thank you very much, Minister. The question is that motion S4M 5273 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Yes. No. We'll go to the vote then, please. Those in favour of motion S4M 5273, please show. Okay. Those against motion S4M 5273, please show. Thank you. There were 4 in favour of the motion, 3 against. The amendment is agreed to. The motion is agreed to, I beg your pardon. If we could move on to agenda item 5, subordinate legislation. That's the motion to annul the Council Tax Administration and Enforcement Scotland Amendment Regulations 2012, SSI 2012/338, on which we have just taken oral evidence. Does any member wish to speak in the debate? No. Margaret Mitchell has already moved motion S4M 5393. The question is that motion S4M 5393 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Therefore, we go to the vote. Those in favour of motion S4M 5393, please show.
This is your motion.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Those against motion S4M 5393, please show. Thank you. One in favour of the motion, and we have 6 against. The motion is disagreed to. If we move on to item 6 in the agenda, and that's the motion to annul Council Tax Exempt Dwelling Scotland Amendment Order 2012, SSI 2012/339, in which we have just taken oral evidence. Does anyone wish to speak in this debate? No. Margaret Mitchell has already moved motion S4M 5394. The question is that motion S4M 5394 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. In which case we go to the vote. Those in favour of the motion, please show. Okay. And those against the motion, please show. Thank you. In favour of the motion is 1. Against the motion is 6. The motion is disagreed to. Thank you very much for that. If we could suspend for 5 minutes to allow for a change in witnesses. Thank you very much for your time today, Minister and gentlemen. If we can move on to agenda item 7. The next item of business is an oral evidence session with the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman on his 2011-12 annual report. Members have a copy of the report along with a briefing paper from SPICE. I'd like to welcome Jim Martin, Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, Emma Gray, Head of Policy and External Communications, Paul McFadden, Head of Complaint Standards, and Nikki McLean, Director, Scottish Public Service Ombudsman. Mr Martin, would you like to make an opening statement to the committee, please?
Very briefly, Convener, because you have my annual report, and we've sent you a note of items that I've tried to lift from that report that you may be interested in. What I would like to do is just cover a couple of points. We're projecting in 2012-13, that's this year that we're in, that we will take somewhere around 4,100 to 4,200 complaints. In 2009-10, that number was 3,307. And in the period between 2009-10 and our last annual report, there's been an increase of 23% in the complaints coming to my office. In the main, this is because of additions to our jurisdiction. In that time, we've taken responsibility for complaints in the prison service. We've taken on Scottish Water and other water complaints, including Business Stream, the commercial arm of Scottish Water. And we've taken prison health complaints. The increase in the last year, in 2011-12, was 12% in a single year. So we're seeing an increased demand for our services. Like all public sector bodies and bodies responsible, whose funding comes from the Parliament, we've been asked to reduce our spending. And if we strip out the additions to our jurisdiction, we will have achieved a 15% reduction in our spending over that period. We will, in fact, be spending less cash in 2012-13 than we were spending in 2010 and 11. The headcount in that part of my organisation, which deals with complaints, because I have two cores, I have complaints and I've got the Complaint Standards Authority, which is about setting up complaint handling procedures in the public service. The headcount in the complaint side has been reduced by 2 full-time equivalents. Now, we're not a big organisation, and that has an impact. I have to say, though, that the productivity in my office in the year that you're looking at in our annual report increased by 12%. And that was at a time when we had significant numbers of staff off in long-term sickness. I'm pleased to say not work-related sickness, but long-term sickness. The reason I'm going through this litany is, like all public sector bodies, we're trying to do more with less. But when we're a demand-led organisation, it is very, very difficult to meet expectations on service levels when we're faced with the kind of increase in demand that we have and the reduction in resources that we have. We changed our methods of working in 2010. I think had we not done that, we'd have been in serious trouble. I think that we are far more efficient now than we were then, and that's got us through. You'll see that I've highlighted that in the coming 12 months, there are 4 or 5 different areas which may be brought in, which might impact on my organisation. The impact of that is as yet unquantified because the decisions have yet to be taken. But I just wanted to put a marker down with the committee that the one thing that seems not to be stopping is the increase in demand. In this financial year, the one that we're currently in, we reckon that we'll be somewhere between 5 and 7% ahead of where we were on last year, which, remember, was an increase of 12%. Something will have to give if the resource issues remain the same. And the two areas where that is most likely are in the timescales in which we deal with things, or in quality. And I'm very, very reluctant to touch quality. Those of you who have had a chance to look at our external survey of stakeholder views, complainants' views, you'll see that the thing that people want us to maintain is quality and rigour ahead of time. We will try to do that, but it's going to get increasingly difficult. So that's point one, Convener. The second one is I want to pay tribute to the work of the team in my office who are the Complaint Standards Authority, who are trying to deliver standardised complaint handling procedures across the public service in Scotland. By the end of this financial year, all local authorities in Scotland and all housing associations will be operating under the new model complaint handling procedures. And by October, all further education and higher education establishments will as well. And we're beginning now to look at the government and government agencies, around 100 bodies, which will be our target for the next financial year. I think that the fact that we've got so far so quickly and with so much cooperation and working in partnership with so many bodies is a tribute to my team, led by Paul McFadden, who's here today. And that's an area which I think will have real impact on local authorities, and one that the committee might want to explore, and we'd be happy for you to do that. One of the spin-offs, of course, of this is that Audit Scotland have agreed to check for compliance with the complaint handling procedures. And we will soon, I hope in 2013-14, and if not, certainly in 2014-15, be able to bring to the committee a view on where complaints are arising in local government in Scotland, how they're being dealt with, and what the outcomes are looking like. So that may be good data for this committee to use in its work. The last thing, Convener, is, if I may, just suggest 2 or 3 corrections in the SPICE briefing, which I know the committee have had. I think there are 1 or 2 errors there. There is a statement in the SPICE briefing that in 2011-12 we did not lay any reports pertaining to local authorities to Parliament. In the annual report, you'll see that we did in fact lay 11 reports, almost 1 a month, about local authorities in Scotland. The second point in the briefing is that it indicates that reports relating to decision letters were not found anywhere. And the reason for that, Convener, is that we are not permitted by our statute to publish our decision letters in full. And in 2010, we sought and gained permission from Parliament to publish summaries of our decision letters. So that's just slightly misleading in there. And in fact, 77, I think, summaries of decision letters are going to be laid before Parliament today, which go back, I think, to December. And the last thing in the briefing, it says that we claim but cannot show that we publish positive actions by bodies under my jurisdiction, like local authorities. We do. It's in the website, and we'd be happy to sit down with SPICE and talk them through where to find that. So just wanted to put that on the record, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Martin. In terms of the evidence which you gave the committee last year, a lot of what you had to say was based around your strategic plan, which was quite new at that point. And having looked through a number of the bits and pieces that we have here, including your annual report, there doesn't seem to be very much about your strategic plan in these documents. Could you tell us why that is the case? And I do hope that your strategic plan is not like many others that have come across in other bodies over the years, where it's put together and then goes on a shelf and gathers dust.
We're lacking shelf space apart from anything else, Convener, so that is not the case. I think I explained to the committee before, the strategic plan that we bring forward is approved by the Scottish Parliament's corporate body. The parts of that, how that plan is implemented, are contained in business plans, which are approved by the corporate body. So we've been engaged with the corporate body in discussing the strategic plan, progress against it, and our business plan. My director, Nicky McLean, and Paul McFadden meet monthly with the corporate body to talk through where we are in relation to our business plan, our strategic plan, and our budget. So all of these things are there. The corporate body is asking us to change the way that we make our annual report, to change the content of our annual report better to reflect the strategic plan, and next year's annual report will do that. So the strategic plan is a living document, and the scrutiny of that plan is undertaken by the officials of the corporate body on a regular, I would say, monthly basis.
That's all fair and well, Mr. Martin, that the corporate body and your staff are reviewing this on a regular basis. But I think the thing here is members of the public should be able to see exactly what is going on vis-à-vis that strategic plan and its implementation. And from these documents that we have here, which would be the kind of documents that members of the public would have a look at, you know, it doesn't seem to me from this and a number of other things that strategic plan is a living and breathing document. It may well be to Ms McLean and Mr McFadden and members of the corporate body, but to members of the public it seems that it is slightly amiss. And since so much emphasis was put on that when you gave evidence last year, I would ask that you look and ensure that the members of the public who pay very close attention to the SPSO actually see what is happening there in terms of implementation of that plan.
Very clear, Convener. The strategic plan begins in 2012-13. The annual report that you're asking me questions about is the annual report for 2011-12. So that the annual report for 2012-13 will reflect the strategic plan as agreed, and will reflect it in the way that the corporate body has asked us to do that. So, if you like, I'm between two masters here. One is the corporate body looking at it. I agree with you that the public should see that, and I think you will agree with me, I hope, that we publish as much information as we possibly can. But it would not be possible to produce progress against a strategic plan that doesn't kick in until after the annual report we are discussing has ended.
But Mr Martin, I would say that in terms of the plan itself, we should have an indication in these documents about how it is going to become implemented when it becomes a live document. Now, I think that this is remiss in this, to be honest with you. And, you know, there is quite a lot of criticism out there of your organisation, much of which you will come across on a day and daily basis. Like the last time you were here, we've had a flurry of communications prior to you coming here. That's to be expected in the game that you are in, it has to be said. What I would ask of you, Mr Martin, is that you provide the committee with a written report about implementation of that strategic plan. I think that we would like to see that, and I think it would make your life a lot easier if that was available to the public as well.
I'm very happy to do that, Convener, but can I stress that strategic plan that the corporate body is currently asking us to report on that strategic plan in a particular way? Could I ask maybe the clerks of the two committees to discuss whether the format that comes up is suitable to both committees? Because what I don't want to do next year is sit with this committee with a report which is appropriate for the corporate body, but which is not appropriate for this committee. So if the clerks could perhaps get their heads together, we'll happily comply with that.
I'm quite happy to have a written report on what is actually being given to the corporate body at this moment in time. I don't want to create any more work for you. If we could have that, I would be immensely grateful. If we could move on The role of the SPO, a model complaint service and a final tier complaints resolver are how you describe the organisation. That's quite different from an appellate body. Could you explain the difference and elaborate on what you do? Do the public understand the difference? And if not, what steps are you taking to address that?
I think that the abolition of the AGDC in England, and therefore the Scottish Committee of the AGDC in Scotland, has brought this issue to the fore. And I know the government and others are looking at what the administrative justice landscape in Scotland should look like. We are a complaints body. The powers that I have are set out in the 2002 Act as approved by Parliament. That brought together 4 different ombudsman's offices, each with slightly different powers and each with different areas of jurisdiction. So that, for example, the health powers that I have currently include allowing me to look at clinical decision making. The powers I have in local authorities allow me to look at matters where there is not the use of discretion by local authorities, except where there's maladministration or service failure. This means that any area where people believe that the services they have received in bodies under my jurisdiction are not up to scratch can bring them to me. The way that we have structured our office is that at the front end, we will listen to people when they come in and then signpost them to the appropriate areas. Some of these might be what you're describing as appellant bodies, maybe tribunals, maybe other bodies. But our aim is to make sure that the citizen gets to the point where the decision can best be made on the issues that they bring. I've seen definitions put about before which suggest that tribunals and appellant bodies deal with cases where there's a very clearly defined benefit that people can get, and therefore a tribunal can look at that kind of thing, whereas complaints around maladministration and service failure don't fit easily into that model. I think the public generally are confused about where to go about complaints and their rights of appeal in a number of areas. What we try to do is we try to signpost them to the appropriate body to deal with their appeal, their complaint, or wherever it may be. I think if the committee and other committees want to look at the administrative justice system and how it should go forward post the abolition of the Scottish Committee, then I think that is something that should be done, but should be done in concert with the government and also in concert with the UK government, because we have got UK bodies operating in Scotland at the same time. It's a very confused landscape.
You talked about time earlier on. In terms of a complaint that comes into your office where you have no jurisdiction, how quickly do you get back to the complainant, and do you offer them that advice of where to go next?
That's exactly what we would do. So if it's very obviously out of jurisdiction, that would be something that our advice team would deal with pretty much as soon as somebody calls, and part of that service is about redirecting and signposting the person to the correct route. If it requires some more in-depth review, it would normally be dealt with within 2 weeks, unless it's a very complex case where it needs legal advice, for example, around jurisdiction, but normally within 2 weeks, and the individual would be signposted to the correct service.
Okay. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. Mr Martin, what defines high quality service in the eyes of your customers, and how do you measure it?
If you look at the Craigforce survey, which is the one about complainants, you'll see in there that their view is that views on quality of service can very often be guided by the outcome of the decisions that we take, and that is the same for, I think, all ombudsman offices that I know of. What we have tried to do is to find, if we can find a quality assurance system which allows us to look at the quality of the work which has been produced across our organisation, the quality of decision making, the speed with which we can do that, and then to test and to learn the lessons from that. So we we brought in a new quality assurance methodology a year ago, 2 years ago. We've run that, we've had that externally tested by our internal auditors and looked at, and we're constantly trying to learn how to improve quality. But Nikki McLean, I think, looks after quality assurance. She may be able to add to that.
I think in terms of the quality assurance, we look at a number of aspects. So we look at was the decision the correct one? Was the way in which that decision was communicated clear for the complainant, including, for example, the point about if something's out of jurisdiction, were they clearly signposted elsewhere? And as Jim says, we also would look at things like the timescales involved in handling of that complaint.
Like you mentioned earlier on, Mr Martin, if the inquiries and the complaint numbers are rising and you're reducing your budget, how are you going to manage to deliver the quality service to your customers?
The quality is the thing that I think that goes last. Those of you who know the history of the SPSO will know that 2 or 3 years ago the biggest issue was it was taking forever to get a decision. We had cases 3, 4 and 5 years old in the office. We don't have that now. So we have that under control. What I'm concerned about is that if you look at the other areas that may be added to my jurisdiction soon, and you look at the demand that's coming in, while having to cut resources, then one of two things really has to go at the end of the day, either the timescales that we are operating to or the quality of the work that we're doing. And everything tells me that the thing that will be sacrificed will be timescales rather than quality, because the quality of the decision making, I think, looking at the Craigforce survey and going out and talking to people, is the thing that matters to them. People tell me, sometimes I've had complaints from people saying you're taking decisions too quickly. In the past we've got, criticised for not taking decisions quickly enough. We are, culturally, what we're trying to drive into the organisation is quality, quality, quality.
Taking John Wilson with a supplementary, please.
Just for clarification, Convener, good morning, Mr Martin. Could I clarify how many people were contacted regarding the Craigforce survey, and what is that as a percentage of the number of complaints you deal with over a given period?
We changed the methodology with Craigforce this year at their suggestion, because previously, well, in fact, I'll let Emma Gray deal with it. She's the person who's the architect of it.
As we outlined in the briefing, we've sought customer feedback for the last 6 years, and for the first 4 or 5 years of that, we did a quantitative postal written type questionnaire. On the advice of Craigforth, who said that we were getting the same kind of feedback every year and that there was nothing new to learn from continuing to do that kind of survey, we moved to a qualitative style survey. They wrote to all of the people who'd received our service and asked them to join focus groups. 33 people, so a very small percentage of complainants, but we have no control over who wishes to be involved in a focus group, came to the 2 focus group sessions that Craigforce set up, and the findings of their discussions are what constitutes the current survey.
My calculation is that's roughly less than 3% of the total number of people who have used the service in a given period. How do you find that method of surveying users of the service compared to the previous way in which the surveys were conducted, such as writing to all the users and asking them for their views?
I think it's brought us tremendously valuable information. You can only get so far in a questionnaire. We ask people, how satisfied were you with the service, sort of on a scale from very to not at all. What we wanted to do was to probe, well, what is it about our service that you're not satisfied with? Is it how we communicate with you? Is it the timescales? Is it the decision that we made? Was there something that we could have done better to have improved how we communicated what we can and cannot do, and so on? And that was what the Craigforth data gave us. It was that people preferred to have more face-to-face contact, more time on the telephone. They, by and large, there were exceptions, but by and large, people would prefer a more informal means of speaking with our complaints reviewers rather than going through formal written channels. And what we've done in response to that, as you'll see in the SPSO management response to the findings, is to roll out a much greater emphasis on face-to-face contact, telephone contact, especially where the circumstances of the complaint are very distressing to people. We've done 2 sessions of telephone skills training, and we approached the Samaritans to run that because many of the people who come to us are extremely stressed or distressed about the circumstances of their complaint. So we wanted to have people who had a real handle on how you deal with people who are extremely emotionally traumatised in some cases, and to help our reviewers deal with the kinds of issues that people bring to us. So I think it's given us a real feel for what it is that people have not been happy about, and an opportunity to change what we do and bring out training in the areas that people are telling us they'd like us to improve in.
Convener, there are other questions that we'll ask, but I know there's other members waiting to get into the present moment. I'll use an opportunity at the end of the questioning session to further examine this issue.
Thank you, Mr Wilson. If we could remain with the Craigforth report at this moment in time, and I have it in front of me here at this moment, in terms of the messages, I would be interested to know how you are improving on those findings. The conclusion of the Craigforth report states, based on the people spoken to as part of this study, it is fair to say that taking a complaint to the SPSO is unlikely to result in indifference or ambivalence towards the organisation. It is unusual to speak to a group of people who are so clearly and significantly divided about an organisation, as was the case for listening to complainants 2012. Unsurprisingly, people's views were largely coloured by the final outcome in their case. Those that did not achieve the outcome they had hoped for, either because the SPSO was not able to take on their complaint or because their complaint was not upheld, tended to be dissatisfied. Very understandably, their strength of feeling was often linked to the nature of their complaint, with those that had made a complaint relating to very difficult and personal events often left very disappointed by their contact with the SPSO. I have to say that for myself and colleagues around this table, there are very often cases which we are unable to resolve for people. However, most folk, if you talk that through with them, understand the reasoning behind that. It seems that in the case that you have, a lot of people are not understanding about why you cannot deal with their complaint any further. Do you have any reason for that situation? Because, in this life, I find that the vast bulk of people are pretty reasonable. And if you give them an explanation about why you can't do something, they don't like it, but they normally understand it.
We do try and give as full an explanation as possible as to why we've reached a decision and going through it. If you look at the Craigforth survey, one of the richest pieces that comes from that is that people are least happy when we explain the restrictions on the powers that we have. So that, for example, looking at local authority, particularly in areas like planning, people will bring planning issues to us. We'll tell them there are areas that we can and can't look at. For example, we cannot overturn a planning decision. And very often people are very, very angry and upset that we can't do that. And in fact, I've had members who have brought cases to me of their own, who have said to me, I want you to look at this issue, and I've had to explain to them that under the 2002 Act, I am precluded from looking at some of these things, and some of these are very annoyed as well. So that is one issue, is around the powers. Secondly, I think it's important to remember the stage that we come in at. We come in after the complaint has been aired and rehearsed up till now, but not in the future, say in local authorities, sometimes through 4 or 5 stages in a local authority. So the matter's been rehearsed, people have very firm views and are coming to us as a kind of last resort. And at that point, we are the people who actually say, no, there is no further route for you to go. and that can upset people. In health cases, we deal with cases which are heart-rending, absolutely heart-rending for the families involved. And very often, we have to say to them, although your case is very difficult, say involving a death or whatever, we have found that the practitioners or whoever have acted appropriately, and people react emotionally to that. So being at the end of the line, that is something which we have come to expect. And I've discussed this with my colleagues in other ombudsmen's offices in the United Kingdom to see if anybody's getting it right. And I have to tell you that it is par for the course for an ombudsman's office that people who get decisions that they agree with and like tend to think the organisation is marvellous, and people who don't tend not to. I'm afraid it comes with the turf.
Again, I would say that for many of us round the table and fellow parliamentary colleagues, you know, we're not in a dissimilar position to yourselves in the fact that sometimes we have to tell folk, you know, this is as far as we can go with this particular case, often heart-rending like some of the ones that you have dealt with. I have to say that if somebody had come to my office, hadn't got the decision that they wanted, but were so deeply unhappy as some of the folk who have come to you are, then I would be worried about the way that I have communicated with that person. And I think that that's something that, you know, the Craigforth findings will help you improve. Because at the end of the day, I think one of the things which we find, particularly in the run-up to these sessions, is correspondence from people who I think, if they had been communicated with a little bit better, would not be in the position that they are currently in.
That may be your view, Convener. One of the things we do in our quality assurance is we look at how we're responding to people when we're breaking news to them that they don't like. And we're trying very hard to learn lessons on how to do that. And in some cases, we will not get it right. I concede we're a normal organisation, we won't. I think by and large, though, that we do. And I think if the committee were to take soundings from other parts of the United Kingdom and other ombudsmen's offices, you'll find that very similar things happen when ombudsmen come before committees like this. Like committees do get people who write to them. I would probably hazard a guess, you don't get many of the people who are satisfied, and we think we've done a good job writing to the committee to praise us. But that is something, as I said, I think when I was here last year, that we try to minimise, we try to treat everyone fairly and in the same way, but people will come to you and you must make your judgments from that.
Okay, members? Mr McMillan?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Martin. Just a couple of questions. One of them just is regarding the complaints, and when you are upholding more complaints, I'm interested to establish kind of what redress are complainants receiving, and also do you feel as if you actually have adequate powers of enforcement? And finally, what follow-up action do you take to ensure that your decisions actually are implemented?
Okay. Can I take the redress question secondly? On enforcement, we monitor carefully all of the recommendations that we make. Every recommendation that leaves our office goes with a timescale for implementation, and that is followed up and checked to make sure that it has happened. I think I came to the committee last year, Convener, and I think I mentioned two authorities who I thought were possibly on the brink of telling me that they were not going to implement my recommendations. They did in the end, and I think perhaps one of the reasons was that we had the conversation in this committee that maybe concentrated some minds. One thing that I'm beginning to get increasingly concerned about is the redress that we currently offer. In the main, we try to see if we can put someone in the position that we're in before whatever it was that went wrong happened. if we possibly can. Very often that is apology. I'm looking around my colleagues in the rest of the United Kingdom, and I note that there was a judicial review in Northern Ireland in December which upheld the current practice there of the Ombudsman offering consolatory payments to members of the public where he believes that the actions of a body under his jurisdiction are such that it requires it. So that, for example, he asked in the case that was taken to judicial review that a general practitioner pay £10,000 to a patient or the family of a patient that he'd been dealing with. That is an area in Scotland that we haven't gone down. But increasingly, I'm beginning to think that we need to look at the powers that I have in that area to see whether people in Scotland are currently at a disadvantage compared to people in the rest of the United Kingdom. So that's an area which in the next year or so I think has to be addressed and has to be looked at, because I think we've got to the position that we're in today through evolution. That's what happened in the 4 offices that were brought together, then the SPSOs that's come through. And it may be time to take stock of that. In health, it is sometimes not possible to put people back in the position they were. But I have to say, the National Health Service and the Scottish Prison Service are very good at learning the lessons from things that have gone wrong. And one of the things that people who come to me say most is that they hope that the outcome of us looking at things is that we'll make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. And I think from the health services point of view, we are having a real effect. I mentioned earlier that we produce 77 summaries today of decisions, and we do that every month, a number. These summaries are there for learning, and across local authorities, housing associations, health, universities, increasingly people are taking that up. So one of the impacts that we are having is making sure that people are learning from the mistakes of others as they go forward. So the question of redress is one that I'm looking at and thinking about quite hard at the moment.
You've raised a few points there, and certainly supplementary questions. In terms of the issue of the powers that you have you raised, what you've just said there, have you actually raised that thus far with certainly with the Scottish Government in terms of legislation, in terms of potentially amending the law as it stands to give yourselves more powers?
Not yet, because I want to get my thinking clear first. One of the things I wanted to do was to wait to see what the outcome of the judicial review in Northern Ireland was and the powers there. But bear in mind, Parliament reviewed my office's powers 4 or 5 years ago now and decided that the powers should stay the same. For example, one of the areas where other ombudsman's offices can be effective is in own power initiatives, where if you see a number of things happening, an ombudsman can instigate an investigation into an area, say, for example, on aspects of care for the elderly, or in terms of how things have been dealt with in planning in a particular council, for example. At the moment, I have no powers to do that. I can only react to individual complaints as they're brought to me. One of the other areas that is sometimes said, put to me, is that instead of having the power to recommend, I should have the power to direct. And I'm less sanguine about that, because I'm not convinced that the Ombudsman should have the power to direct the budgets of bodies under jurisdiction. And I may have used this example with the committee at previous meetings. If I have, I apologise for repeating it. But one piece of advice I had from a medical advisor, which I chose not to accept and put in the form of recommendation, was that in case of multiple births, that multiple births should take place in an operating theatre. And at first hearing that sounds fine until you work out what the impact of that is on the health service in Scotland. So had I been in a position to have recommended that, that's one thing that could be considered. Had I been in a position to direct a health board that they should do that, that is quite another. And I think directing spend is a very, very important issue that should be kept to the democratic people in local authorities or in government or wherever, and not something an ombudsman should have. I don't think an ombudsman should have the power to direct.
You raised a few moments ago in terms of the help in the NHS and the Scottish Prison Service being very good at actually learning the lessons and moving forward, and it's certainly good to hear that. But obviously, I mean, in terms of the health service, there are 14 health boards. What follow-up work does your office undertake to ensure that? I mean, you produce a recommendation that the NHS, they decide also there's going to be some changes to follow your recommendations. So what follow-up work do you actually undertake to ensure that actually that this actually has happened within the health service?
Can I maybe add to that in terms of your liaison with audit bodies to make sure that they're aware of the decisions that you have made so that they can do the follow-up work in the health boards or local government or wherever it may be?
In terms of the recommendations that we make, so boards are notified of the recommendations through investigation reports or decision letters, and very often, or in all cases, they're given a timescale that they need to meet, and they have to provide us with adequate evidence to demonstrate that they've fulfilled those recommendations. So depending on the type of recommendation, depends on the type of evidence that we would expect them to produce to demonstrate that they've met that recommendation.
So, for example, we may say, as we did say to, I think, the Southern General Hospital in Glasgow at one point, we need you to reassure us that you have an action plan in place in a particular area for dealing with pressure sores in elderly people in hospital. So, in response to us, Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board then produced an action plan and evidence that it was in place, so that we do follow up on these things. If I can say, one area where it is important to the individuals bringing complaints, where authorities are getting better, is in apologising appropriately. We very rarely now get letters sent to complainants saying the Ombudsman has told me I have to apologise to you. Here is a letter saying I apologise. And I think if we can get better at apologising earlier for things that go wrong, then maybe my caseload would go down, because very often that's all people are looking for. And that's a very important part of redress, is acknowledgement and apology.
Can I add something? Yeah. I'd just like to add that certainly as regards the health complaints, the Scottish Government always logs the recommendations that we've made, and they too follow up with boards. They also say, this is what the Ombudsman recommended, can we please have the evidence that you've fulfilled this recommendation? So in addition to our doing our own checks, and I think one of the reasons why lessons are so well shared within the NHS and the Scottish Prison Service is that there is that kind of coordination and follow-up by the bodies, by the kind of umbrella of the bodies themselves. So I think that adds sort of extra impetus to the recommendations.
One kind of final question on this area, Convener. Just it's in terms of also your KPI 5 measure. Obviously, it's regarding measuring how quickly the organisations actually implement the recommendations. Obviously, your target is 95%. What actually, although that's your target, what actually is the percentage result that you have thus far?
Yeah, it was around 88% for the 11-12 year that we're reporting on. I think the interesting thing about that particular measure is obviously ultimately it's down to the board or to the body to ensure that they meet with that timetable, as Jim's already highlighted what our statutory powers are in that regard. So we work very, very hard to ensure that boards and bodies meet these timescales, but ultimately it is a matter for them.
That's fine at the moment, thank you.
If I could, before I bring in Mr. Pentland, could I ask you, you talked about the parliamentary review of the organisation that took place a few years back, and obviously some of us were not parliamentarians at that time. My understanding that review was more about increasing the powers in terms of bringing in new bodies rather than a full review of what you did. Could you maybe go into some detail on that?
I think that's true that was looked at, but I think also in the course of that review, areas like own initiative powers were discussed by the body that looked at it. Was called the RSSB.
Yeah, the review of the bodies supported by the SPCB.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll have a further look at that at a later date. Mr. Pentland.
Thank you, Convener. Following your last appearance to the committee last year, obviously your comments have been well analysed, and some of the people who have been in touch have kind of reaffirmed that they don't think the organisation is fit for purpose. And would you like to make some comment on that?
I think it goes to the exchange the convener and I had earlier. When I finished speaking to the committee last time, a number of ombudsmen in the United Kingdom had either freedom of information requests or requests to confirm that what I said to the committee was accurate in terms of the numbers of UK ombudsman bodies who were coming to us to study how we were doing things, to study our processes, to study our quality assurance, and that kind of thing. My own office was still receiving FOI requests, I think, 10 months after my last appearance at the committee. And I expect that will probably happen again after this visit to the committee. And I'm sure that the committee's mailbag about my office's activities will tend to increase as I come to the committee. And I know that from discussions between my office and the clerks to the committee, that there's an ongoing correspondence between some people and the clerks of your committee as well. I suspect in many of these cases there's not a lot I can do to make that stop or to improve it. I think that checking out with other ombudsmen's offices in the United Kingdom, I'm reassured is maybe the wrong word, but it makes me happier to know that they're in much the same position whenever they go to a committee as well. So I'm afraid, as I said to the convener earlier, that is something which I expect will continue.
In your annual report, you highlight this in your introduction. You talk about the complaints trends, and you say that the number of the complaints that comes to yourselves could perhaps be reduced if local authorities, for example, sort of tightened up on their complaints process. Would you like to maybe expand on that?
I'll ask Paul McFadden to say a word or two about what we're doing with local authorities on their complaints handling process. I think the quicker you can resolve an issue which arises, the nearer to the complainant in time and in geography you can, the better. And I think that when things are allowed to fester in systems and come up, that leads to entrenched positions, and it makes it very difficult then to get solutions which can satisfy both parties. But I'll ask Paul to talk to you about the work that we've been doing with Scotland's local authorities to try and improve the process and procedures.
Yes, thank you. Jim mentioned earlier in his opening remarks that by the end of March all local authorities will have committed to have in place a model complaints handling procedure in line with the standardised model that we are outlining across all public sector bodies. We're actually ahead of expectations in that regard. As of September last year, over a quarter of local authorities confirmed to us that they were already operating that streamlined two-stage model across all of their service, which we regard as great progress and a testament to how serious they are taking this. At the core of what we're trying to achieve is a standard model across all 32. Within that, I think there's the clear aim is a quicker resolution of complaints. So the two stages, as opposed to the 4 or 5 Jim already alluded to in some authorities, standard timescales of 5 and 20 days. So there's clear standards in terms of process and timescales, but I think even more than that, going beyond that, in terms of resolution of complaints and actually trying to kind of reduce the numbers coming to us, for example, is a cultural element to that, and I think it's very much a focus of empowering frontline staff, trying to formalise the initial interaction with customers to resolve those complaints as close to the point of service as you can, the vast majority of issues that people complain about are relatively straightforward to resolve as close to that. Whereas if staff are not trained or authorised to, for example, apologise for a service failure, they can escalate through all those stages and come to us. And by that point, they've gone arms and legs and another 10 heads of complaint. So a very strong focus is on face-to-face and telephone contact, resolving as close to the point of contact and service as possible. I think the second part of that cultural element is a get it right first time. A lot of the stages of appeal that have previously existed in complaints processes, we have seen used or regarded potentially as a safety net before the complaints would get to the Ombudsman, that we've got another chance to look at this. And I think the onus is very much on a one-off investigation of 20 days before the complaint has the opportunity to come to us. And I think that culture of getting it right first time through training and through awareness, and also through better learning of complaints from the ones that come to us that we uphold, but also that individual local authorities and departments within local authorities and other local authorities trying to learn from the complaints that they have resolved and the lessons that they've had from those.
So I would assume then it's still work in progress for that learning curve.
Well, yeah, we have seen, as I say, a move by over a quarter of local authorities to adopt that, and I think yes, I think some of the cultural elements are no doubt something that will take time, but we are seeing councils taking this very seriously, and I think it's something we would expect to see progress in terms of their complaints handling very quickly.
In your introduction, Mr. Martin, you were able to give us some figures with regards to the complaints you've received over the past 4 years. During that period of time, could you perhaps tell us the number of complaints that actually came against the SPCO?
Yes, we have a process for service delivery complaints about our own service. We received 32 for the year in question in 2011-12. We have an independent service delivery reviewer who currently is David Thomas, former Deputy Ombudsman of Financial Ombudsman Service. 13 of the 32 complaints that we received went on to David Thomas to handle. So 32 in total, 13 of which went on to the independent reviewer.
Do you not think it's probably would be good for the committee if included in your annual report was an actually, you know, the complaints received to yourselves?
It is actually in the report, yes. There's a whole section dedicated to the independent service delivery reviewer, which outlines, as well as the numbers, some of the key themes that came out of those. So there's information there.
Could you maybe talk about your budget? Again, Mr. Martin, you did say that obviously things are being squeezed, and with regards to your budget, having to make efficiencies, etc. Under these circumstances, then, do you think it's perhaps wise that you should be extending your jurisdiction to, you know, a number of other areas? And you know, will that in itself reduce the level of service that there is an expectation to take away this, that, you know, these are
part of, I mean, my jurisdiction is out of my control. The extent of my jurisdiction is out of my control. It's a matter for Parliament and government taking decisions. For example, the creation of Revenue Scotland is a decision that's been taken for, you know, pretty sound reasons. That body will come into being. The fact that it comes into being then automatically means it will come into my jurisdiction, so there's nothing I can do about that. The abolition of the mechanism for handling the social fund by the UK government means that each of the jurisdictions in the United Kingdom has to find a way of administering that social fund. Currently, I believe that that's going to be in a two-tier system administered by local authorities. That then means the work the local authorities are doing in that area will automatically come under my jurisdiction. So there's nothing I can do about that. If you change the responsibilities of local authorities or other public bodies under my jurisdiction, it will have an impact on me. In areas such as prisons and water, there was very careful discussion before they came over about what would happen in terms of resource that would come over, whether people or cash or both would come. And that was very carefully thought through. And that's a really good model in new areas coming in to my jurisdiction, which are about complaint handling. But where it's looking at the impact in other areas, then I'm hoping that by raising it here and with government and others, that people will understand that it will have knock-on effects on bodies like my own. One area that I would indicate to show the difficulty in planning for this is in prisons' health. I mean, until a year ago, health services in prisons were provided by the Scottish Prison Service. The decision was taken that these would then go to the National Health Service. The number of appeals in the Scottish Prison Service out with prisons to Scottish ministers in the last year of their operation was 511. A reasonable calculation would be that something similar would be the maximum that we could expect to come to us. In effect, in the first year, we find that 46 actually came to us. Now, I suspect that's because the system isn't working terribly well yet and that number will increase. But the difficulty you have in planning ahead on impacts such as that is trying to work out whether the impact will be the same, whether it will increase or whether it will reduce. And what we've found is that very often where things come into our jurisdiction which haven't been there before, you get an initial spike of people who want cases that have already been looked at elsewhere, reopened and looked at again, and then it tends to fade away. What I'm trying to highlight here is that if we are going to increase the areas of jurisdiction within the SPSO framework, given the budgetary constraints that we have, if resources don't follow that, then the quality of service that we can offer may not be as great, may not be as good as I would like it to be.
Could I just add to that, though? I think that it starts from this fundamental principle of whether or not you want a one-stop shop for complaints handling, and I know that's something that's been discussed at this committee previously, and I think from our perspective on that would be for the users of public services, that is the sensible approach for them to simplify the landscape for people so that they can easily access complaint services. So whilst behind all of that in the back office there might be complications around resourcing, I think fundamentally that is the way that things should go.
We're running out of time here, so brief questions and concise answers, please.
Actually, on the budget, Chair, was actually in your budget report. You have you spent £163,000 on professional fees. Could you maybe briefly tell us why that was, and could this service not have been delivered in-house?
As we've discussed before, in certain areas of complaint, we require expert advice. So, for example, in health complaints, where we can also look at the actual clinical decision reached, we obviously don't have that expertise in-house. And so what we do is we procure that medical expertise and advice from, at the moment, the Parliamentary and Health Services Ombudsman down south, who do actually contract their own medical advisors. So the majority of that spend relates to professional advice in the different areas that we work in.
And final question, you accrued £93,000 in other income. Can you tell me where that came from?
One of the areas of work that we've been running in support of the Complaint Standards Authority is to actually deliver cost recovery training to bodies under our jurisdiction to train their frontline staff, but also their complaints handling staff in, for example, investigation skills. So that cost recovery income came from, majority of that came from that source.
Okay, thank you. Before I bring in Mr. Wilson, I'm looking at the annual report and the Independent Service Delivery Review, and we have the comments there from the reviewers that there were during that time. Could you maybe tell us what process is in place to send a complaint to the independent reviewer? Who decides that?
The complainant themselves will decide that. We follow a process which is in line with the model we're introducing across the public sector, where we have two opportunities to resolve that complaint. One as a frontline complaint, second a stage 2 complaint, which I will deal with as head of complaint standards. At that point, we will inform the complainant that if they remain dissatisfied, they have the opportunity to approach the independent service delivery reviewer, who will then make his decision on accepting that complaint. So it's at the complainant's behest that those complaints go to ISDR.
Okay, thank you. Mr Wilson.
Thank you very much, Convener. Once again, Mr Martin, I should have put on the record at this present moment I've known Mr Martin for a number of years. I'll not say how many years exactly, but it's more, I think it's up to 3 decades we've known each other. The situation in relation to the earlier responses in terms of what happens with the recommendations, and you did make reference to 2 authorities who you felt at the time were not prepared to implement the recommendations. Now, my understanding is, and this goes back to the previous Parliament when I was in the Local Government and Communities Committee, where we discussed your report, and we discussed the issue about special reports being laid before Parliament. And at that time, we discussed whether or not those powers should be enhanced. Has there been any further movement in relation to the powers of the SPSO laying special reports to the Parliament to effectively force the agencies and authorities that you deal with to actually implement the recommendations of SPSO, or to bring about changes, legislative changes, to ensure that further issues of the natures raised are not repeated?
I'm grateful to this committee because after my last appearance here, you referred the matter to the Standards Committee, and the Standards Committee have been engaging with us, and I think we are due to get back to them by the end of this month. So discussions on that are ongoing, so I'm grateful to the committee for their intervention on that.
Thank you very much for that, Mr Martin. Can I go back, Convener, to the earlier questions I was asking about the Craigforth study, or the review, because you indicated there was 33 people participated in the focus group. Just for clarification, were those 33 people self-selecting individuals? And if they are self-selecting, given the amount of correspondence, emails and other information we receive from dissatisfied customers, if I can put it that way, to the service, surely you're in danger of reflecting the aggrieved individuals, rather than the point you made earlier, Mr Martin, some of the satisfied customers that you may have in relation to the service delivery from the organisation.
Emma Gray worked with Craigforth to put us together to make sure that it was a valid survey, so I'll let Emma deal with that.
Given that the focus groups were to be involving complainants with what we hoped would be views on us that were fresh, what Craigforth did was to write to everyone who'd had a complaint closed in the previous 3 months and ask them if they would like to participate. Now, some of the people who contact the committee may be included in that batch, I don't know. Craigforth, though, wrote to everybody. They were self-selecting. Those who wished to be involved put themselves forward and attended the focus group meetings. I'm not sure what else I can say on that front.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that Jim and I especially see casework letters coming in every day, and I would say on a weekly basis we also see letters from people that are satisfied with the service, including, for example, one this week that I saw where it was a very complex decision letter. It was a complex investigation. We had not upheld the complaints, but the individual thanked us for the level of detail that the investigation had, and thoroughness that the investigator had gone into. So I think that there is a challenge about how we then reflect that back publicly.
I appreciate Ms Gray's response in terms of the previous 3 months closed complaints that then are asked to participate in the survey. How do you measure the ongoing case handling work from individuals, and how do you measure their satisfaction levels in relation to how the cases, ongoing cases, are being handled by SPSO?
I think, Paul's gone through the service delivery complaints. What we try to do when we're handling complaints, it is not as if a complaint simply comes into the building is then dealt with and then goes out with no contact. What we try to ensure is that there's regular contact between the complaints reviewer and the complainant as we go. For example, the very first stage that we get to with complaints, when we're going to look at the complaint, is a conversation with the complainant to determine exactly what it is he or she is complaining about. We then agree ahead of complaint. We write out to the complainant and say, this is what we think that we are about to examine on your behalf. Please sign to say that you agree with that, and it comes back. So we engage from that point on through. Now, in the course of that, we will very often have complainants who will, of their own initiative, contact us to discuss how things are progressing and what have you. But also our complaints reviewers have got set timescales where they have to go back and tell people about the progress that we're making. So it's an interactive thing going through. What we tried to do with Craigforth this time was to see if we could get qualitative feedback that would help add to the quality assurance work that we're doing and the new process that we've brought in to try to ensure that the journey for our customers is as good as it possibly can be.
Thank you very much for that, and take on board the point you made earlier, Mr. Martin, about having two masters. As far as looking at this situation, I think you've got more than two masters. You've got a number of masters who are all demanding their pound of flesh from SPSO. That includes the government, corporate body, this committee, parliamentarians, the public. How do you intend to move forward based on some of the issues that have been raised today, some of the issues that have been raised by the focus group and individuals that have complained to elected members, to get the message over about what exactly SPSO can do for individuals who are making complaints against agencies or local authorities?
If you look at one of the significant numbers in the annual report, is the number of premature complaints which come to the SPSO, and it's reducing. It's gone from about, I think, 53% down to about 42%. One of the issues that we're trying to deal with here is not the SPSO, but how do we get people's complaints resolved as quickly as possible without coming to the SPSO? My colleague in Wales tells me that he is going to have his face on the back of buses in Cardiff. I fear for the people of Cardiff. I think the danger of that approach, and I hope that he doesn't read the record of this meeting, the danger of that approach is that people will come to the Ombudsman rather than perhaps go to the local authority. We are not geared up to deal with that front-end approach. If you remember back, and you probably will because you were on the committee at the time, Mr. Wilson, that Douglas Sinclair suggested that what we should have was a single signposting area for all complaints in Scotland, and it was decided that that would be too costly. Well, they now do that in Wales. Now, maybe we should revisit that, but at the moment, I think our strategy of getting ownership for complaints and for resolving complaints as far as possible to empowered staff in the public service with efficient, quick complaint handling procedures is the best way to deal with the real problem here, which isn't that I'm under so much pressure from so many different masters. It is that the people of Scotland need to have a quick and sure way of resolving their complaints as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Convener. What action do you take to measure the progress towards the delivery of the first part of your vision, which is on page 55 here? Our vision is of enhanced public confidence in high quality, continually improving public services in Scotland, which consistently meet the highest standards of public administration.
You're seeing it in action through the work that's been done in the Complaint Standards Authority by improving the process there. We monthly produce a compendium which shows a distillation of the decisions that we've taken in the previous month, so the 77 that we're issuing today and the 2 publicly laid reports. We engage with Solace, with COSLA, with local authorities. In the moment, part of what I'm doing is meeting every chief executive and of health boards and local authorities in Scotland to go through with them their own body's performance, to get feedback on the performance of the SPSO and how we can improve. And we're looking to engage more and more with people to try to deliver that. If we are going to help to improve public services in Scotland, then I think the learning from what we are seeing, put in context, because we only see, if you like, where things go wrong, or where people perceive things go wrong, to use that to help to improve the delivery of public services.
Any further questions, members? No. Thank you very much for your time today, folks. We now move into private session and suspend the meeting.